The marble pillars of the federal courthouse loomed overhead like silent witnesses to a justice system some feared was slowly eroding. The morning had begun like any other routine: gavel strikes, procedural motions, and a stiff tension in the air. But today wasn't going to be like any other day. Not with Judge Malcolm Brenner presiding. Inside courtroom 4B, the gallery was packed tighter than usual. Lawyers whispered, journalists typed rapidly, and camera flashes from the hallway flickered like distant lightning. Whispers spread like wildfire. Vice President JD Vance was going to testify. No one could remember the last time a sitting VP entered a courtroom as a witness, especially not one this politically charged. Judge Brenner entered promptly at 9 a.m., his black robes billowing like smoke behind him. His reputation preceded him, a man feared, not respected. His disdain for conservative officials, particularly those aligned with Trump-era policies, was hardly subtle. And today, the target was Sterling Baker, a respected small business owner and longtime donor to veterans' causes facing allegations of tax fraud. "Let it be known," Judge Brenner began, his voice echoing through the chamber, "that this court will not be turned into a political stage. I don't care if we're graced by senators, congressmen, or even the president himself. My rules are final." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Then the doors opened. JD Vance stepped in with quiet resolve. No entourage, no bravado, just a thick leather folder in hand and a calm expression that unnerved even seasoned staffers. As he took a seat near the witness box, every eye turned toward him, some with admiration, others with suspicion. Judge Brenner narrowed his eyes. "So, the Vice President graces us with his presence," he said, laced with sarcasm. "Be advised, Mr. Vance, your title carries no weight here." Vance didn't flinch. "Understood, Your Honor. I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as a witness." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. This wasn't just a courtroom hearing. It was a chess match, and everyone knew the opening move had just been played. Judge Brenner smirked, as if daring Vance to test his authority. "We'll see how long that humility lasts," he muttered, reaching for his gavel. "Let's begin." But beneath the judge's forced authority, there was something else, something off. The faint twitch in his left hand, the unusually flushed cheeks, and the way his eyes kept darting toward a locked drawer beneath his bench. JD Vance noticed. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, he slid the folder on his lap just a little closer. This wasn't just about Sterling Baker. It was about something bigger ... Something the judge didn't want the world to see. The courtroom air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves could sense the coming storm. JD Vance sat tall in the witness chair, hands folded neatly, posture calm, but his eyes were locked onto Judge Brenner, analyzing every micro-expression, every flicker of discomfort. The defense attorney stood to begin his questioning, but before he could utter a single word, Brenner raised his hand like a general halting a foot soldier. "Let's set something straight," he snapped, leaning forward. "This is not a rally. This is not a Senate hearing. This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate political theater." A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Even some of the court officers exchanged glances. The hostility was unmistakable now, not just toward the defense, but toward JD Vance himself. The vice president's very presence had triggered something visceral in Brenner. Vance didn't respond. He simply turned slightly to face the judge, his expression unreadable. "I hope you understand, Your Honor," he said evenly, "that I'm here to speak truthfully, not theatrically. What I witnessed during the Faith and Family Foundation audit that's irrelevant." Brenner roared, slamming his gavel with enough force to make a few people jump. "This court will not entertain fairy tales from politically motivated institutions. Stick to the facts, Mr. Vance, and nothing outside the scope of the prosecution." The defense attorney protested. "Your Honor, The documents Vice President Vance submitted. I don't care what he submitted, Brenner snapped. I haven't even looked at them. And I don't plan to. JD Vance raised an eyebrow. You haven't reviewed submitted federal documentation, Your Honor? The room fell dead silent. Brenner's nostrils flared. I don't answer to you. Vance didn't blink. Of course not. You answer to the Constitution. A long pause. The judge stared at him hard. Watch yourself, Mr. Vice President. I've held elected officials in contempt before. Don't think I won't do it again. Vance sat still, calm as ever. But a subtle shift had occurred. The judge's voice, once booming with confidence, now cracked slightly at the edges, and that drawer under his bench. His eyes kept flicking toward it, again and again, as if something inside it was burning a hole through the wood. That's when Vance spoke again. If you have nothing to hide, Your Honor, he said softly, then you won't mind us discussing the May 12th deposition transcripts, the ones sealed hours after your private meeting with counsel. Brenner froze. The room shifted. The tension doubled. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen dropped, but no one dared move. You're walking a very thin line, Mr. Vance, Brenner hissed. One more step out of bounds, and… I'm simply clarifying, Vance interrupted, his tone almost kind, because those sealed records directly contradict the prosecution's narrative. Those records, Brenner growled, have been deemed inadmissible. By whom? Vance asked. The judge didn't answer. Instead, he slammed the gavel again and barked, Next question. But it was too late. Everyone in that courtroom had seen it. The crack in the armor, the panic behind the authority. JD Vance wasn't just offending a man. He was peeling away the layers of a system corrupted by power, ego, and silence. And Judge Brenner? He had just realized that he might not be the one holding the reins anymore. The silence after Vance's question lingered like smoke from a gunshot. Judge Brenner gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles paled. His eyes darted toward the jury box, the prosecution table, even the court reporter, anywhere but Vance's steady gaze. The defense attorney rose, emboldened. Your Honor, given that the prosecution's case rests on a timeline that's now being called into question, we request the court to unseal the May 12th deposition. No, Brenner snapped. Too quickly. Denied. That record was sealed for good reason. Vance tilted his head slightly. And what reason would that be, Your Honor? National security? Witness protection? Or something a little more personal? A wave of low murmurs spread through the gallery like electricity. Someone coughed. A juror shifted in their seat, visibly uncomfortable. The judge tried to steady himself. You're trying to hijack these proceedings with distractions and insinuations. You will not succeed. But Vance didn't flinch. He leaned forward, speaking with a quiet precision that forced every ear in the room to strain. Your Honor, I have here, he said, lifting a thin folder, an audio transcript from a conversation held in your chambers on May 11th, less than 24 hours before that deposition was sealed. In it, you're heard saying, and I quote, I don't care if they have receipts. They won't see daylight under my watch. Brenner's breath caught in his throat. His hand moved involuntarily to the drawer again. Where did you get that? He asked, his voice suddenly tight, rasping. Does it matter? Vance asked calmly. Because if you're confident in your rulings, the source shouldn't concern you. Only the content. The courtroom was a powder keg now. One wrong word, one more gavel slam, and the whole place would erupt. The prosecution attorney fidgeted, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Brenner stood up. It was subtle, but telling. A man no longer certain that his throne still belonged to him. His robes rustled, his posture stiffened, but his voice, it had lost its edge. That recording is inadmissible, he said. Unverified, possibly illegal. It will not be entered into the record. Fine, Vance replied. Then perhaps we should talk about something else, like the Jefferson Grant. The name hit like a slap. Brenner's pupils dilated. You're bluffing. Vance smiled just barely. I suppose we'll find out, he said, because I also have a copy of your personal calendar. Dated March 23rd. Lunch with Michael Carrington, founder of the Jefferson Grant Initiative. The same day you ruled to freeze the accounts of a conservative nonprofit he publicly opposed. Coincidence? The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out. And if we dig deeper, Vance continued, we might find it even more coincidental that the nonprofit's director, Mrs. Linda Bryce, received an anonymous tip just hours before her scheduled testimony, advising her to withdraw or face a federal audit. A long, shaking breath escaped from the judge's lips. He sat back down, slowly, carefully, like a man trying not to fall through ice. You're out of line, Brenner whispered. No, Vance said. I'm finally in the right courtroom. And for the first time since the hearing began, the gallery applauded just once. Just one loud, defiant clap that echoed across the chamber like a bell tolling for the old order. Brenner didn't slam his gavel this time. He just stared at Vance, his jaw clenched, as the walls around him began to crack. The quiet in the courtroom wasn't peaceful, it was surgical. Everyone was watching Judge Brenner like a hawk circling a wounded animal. The robe no longer carried authority. It clung to him like a costume in the final act of a failed play. Vice President Vance, Brenner said slowly, measuring each syllable like a man walking a verbal minefield. You've made some bold insinuations, but unless you're prepared to present admissible evidence, I suggest you. I'm not insinuating anything, Your Honor, Vance interrupted, his tone sharp yet unwavering. I'm stating facts. And if the court will permit, I'd like to introduce Exhibit E. A gasp rippled through the gallery as his assistant stepped forward with a small laptop and set it on the defense table. One keystroke later, a grainy audio clip began to play. They'll never see the funds. Shut it down. I'll handle the paperwork. Just make sure the press never finds out. It was unmistakably Judge Brenner's voice. The judge stood frozen. His lips parted, but nothing came out. His eyes scanned the courtroom, searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. Where did you get that? He asked again, but this time his voice was barely a whisper. This is entrapment. No, Your Honor, Vance replied, not blinking. It's accountability. The prosecutor stood, visibly rattled. Your Honor, if I may request a recess. Denied, Brenner snapped, but his voice cracked on the final syllable. We will not let this circus derail the circus began the moment you started selling justice to the highest bidder, Vance said coldly. A pin could have dropped. The gallery sat in stunned silence, transfixed by the transformation unraveling before their eyes. The untouchable judge was now visibly sweating. His gavel sat unused. His power was slipping through his fingers like sand. Vance continued, slow and deliberate. This isn't just about corruption. It's about betrayal. The people in this room trusted you to uphold the law. But instead, you treated your bench like a throne and the Constitution like a napkin to be thrown away after lunch with donors. Brenner gripped the edge of his desk. I never. There's no proof. Then let's talk about the private security footage, Vance replied, almost gently. From May 12th. The footage that shows your assistant delivering a briefcase unmarked into your chambers just minutes before you ruled against the Harrison family. A ruling that incidentally resulted in the seizure of their farm, which was later purchased by a firm connected to one of your campaign donors. Gasps, murmurs, whispers. Brenner's hands trembled now, visible even from the back of the courtroom. He knocked over his water glass. The sound of it shattering on the floor was like a gunshot. You don't understand, he began. Oh, I understand perfectly, Vance said. You thought no one would ever challenge you. That the robe, the bench, The title would shield you forever. But today, none of that matters. Because you're not the judge anymore. At that, the courtroom doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped inside. No one moved. Not the jury. Not the lawyers. Not even the judge, FBI. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was enough. The gallery held its breath as the agents made their way forward, step by step, toward the bench. Judge Brenner didn't shout, didn't resist. He simply stared at Vance, his mouth twitching, his pride shattered, his legacy bleeding out in silence. And as the agent stood at his side, ready to escort him into history's darkest corner, Vance looked him in the eye one last time. "This isn't revenge," he said softly. "It's justice. The kind you tried to bury." The gavel hadn't even stopped echoing before the headlines began screaming. Breaking. Federal judge melts down in courtroom showdown with JD Vance. Leaked footage. Judge Brenner threatens vice president, then gets arrested. Screens across America lit up. TikTok clips. YouTube shorts. X threads unraveling in real time. The video of the outburst, JD Vance calmly holding his ground while Judge Brenner hurled gavel, and rage had already racked up 4 million views within the first hour. CNN cut to emergency coverage. Fox called it a historic turning point in American justice. Even late-night comedy shows scrambled to rewrite their opening monologues. But no one was laughing, not this time. JD Vance didn't just expose a corrupt judge. He pulled the curtain on something far bigger. A system that had quietly turned justice into performance. On MSNBC, panelists called it reckless, suggesting Vance staged the whole thing to win points with conservatives. On Fox, commentators hailed him as a constitutional hero. On X, the public exploded into two factions. Finally, someone's holding activist judges accountable. This is pure political theater. He knew exactly what he was doing. The one post cut through the noise. A grainy video clip taken by a reporter seated near the back of the courtroom. It captured not just the meltdown, but the look on Brenner's face the moment Vance mentioned the Liberty Foundation's offshore accounts. That was the moment everything changed. Because in that look, that flash of panic, people saw the truth. Suddenly, other stories started resurfacing, old rulings, quiet settlements, sealed transcripts, cases where conservative defendants had been mysteriously shut down by judicial decisions that now looked strategic. Reddit sleuths launched deep dives. Independent journalists posted timelines. One post, titled, "How many Brenners are out there?" trended for 18 hours straight, and then came the leaks. Whistleblowers, clerks, former interns, people who had stayed silent, were silent no more. One anonymous staffer at the courthouse posted, "We've been scared of Judge Brenner for years. He ruled with fear. But today I saw fear in his eyes." Meanwhile, at the Department of Justice, phones were ringing nonstop. Senators demanded answers. JD Vance was quiet, intentionally so. He didn't post a video, didn't issue a fiery press release. He simply released a statement. No one is above the law, not even those who wear the robe. But the silence did more than any speech. It left the country to fill in the blanks, and that made it louder. In kitchen tables, barbershops, classrooms, and Senate chambers, one question now echoed. If Brenner fell, who's next? And more importantly, how deep does it go? At precisely 9:03 a Miesming's morning, federal marshals escorted Judge Brenner out of his luxury brownstone in D.C. Bathrobe, disheveled hair. No gavel this time, just a trembling hand shielding his face from a swarm of flashing cameras. The same man who screamed, "I am the law," was now surrounded by it. By 10 a.m., footage of his arrest was the lead story on every major network. Fox ran the headline, "Justice reclaims her throne." CNN's Chiron was colder. Federal judge taken into custody amid corruption scandal. But the real story wasn't Brenner anymore. It was the crack in the system, now widening by the minute. Overnight, the Department of Justice launched a special inquiry into judicial bias and financial conflicts of interest. Codename: Operation Gavel Drop. 12 other judges quietly retained legal counsel. 3 prominent attorneys recused themselves from ongoing cases. And the Liberty Foundation? Their website vanished. Their offices were closed for renovation. But insiders whispered they were already burning files before dawn. Meanwhile, JD Vance stood at a podium on the Capitol steps. No speechwriters, no teleprompters. Just a man who'd seen too much and finally decided to fight back. "The robe is sacred," he said calmly. "But when the people wearing it forget who they serve, it's our duty to remind them." He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He was measured, and that made it hit even harder. The press begged for details. Was this a sting? Was this coordinated? But Vance just smiled. "Let's just say," he paused, "we've been watching for a while, and we're not done yet." That single quote sparked a political aftershock. A new committee formed. Petitions exploded. People weren't just angry. They were awake. And Brenner? He sat in a cold holding cell, staring at the metal bench across from him, where a U.S. Marshal had quietly placed a folder. Inside, financial records, testimony transcripts, surveillance stills, and the final nail, his own clerk's signed affidavit. They had it all. There was no way out. The robe no longer protected him. The system no longer shielded him. His last words before arraignment? "I thought I was untouchable." The judge didn't reply, because now someone else was wearing the robe. And this time, it was someone who remembered what it stood for.